Islamic philosophy has two roads. One of them is the philosophers themselves, people like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and they pursue a very specific philosophical tract, but because they were believers, they obviously bring in Islam to some degree. The other track, though, is really a philosophical track that's profoundly rooted in the Islamic tradition itself. And so you see the flourishing of it with people like Al-Ghazali, and then ultimately moving into the great scholastics of the Islamic theological tradition. So these are the people like Sa'duddin Taftazani, Adaduddin al-Iji, Fakhruddin al-Razi, and they're using the philosophers, but they're really integrating them into the Islamic tradition. So it's a very rich tradition, but it's rooted in the Quran, and I think it's rooted, first of all, in the idea that the world is created, that there is an ex nihilo creation of God. So they're very interested in proving or giving rational beliefs for that. So the Kalam cosmological argument comes out of that, this idea that to prove the world had a beginning. Something obviously at the time the philosophers who were the scientists of that time did not believe. And so it's very interesting that the prophets asserted something that would have been anti-scientific, and yet today scientists are asserting what the prophets had asserted, you know. So, and also the end of the world, that the world comes to an end. So I think there's a very rich Islamic philosophical tradition. It eventually moves in almost entirely into a religious metaphysical tradition, and it's kept alive today largely by the Shia community. So the Shias have a great philosophical tradition that they still adhere to. In the Sunni world, there are still pockets, but overall it's more become a formal tradition, where more dogmatic, where they learn dogmatically the text as opposed to really delving deep into the philosophical issues. But there is a resurgence of kalam and of philosophy amongst young Muslims, so it's interesting.
Let's go back to the origin, as you said, in the two foundations. One is the pure philosophy, and one is the philosophy embedded in the religious tradition. What are some examples of each, and how do they articulate?
Well, I think what happens with the Arabs, I mean, obviously the Arabs before Islam are relegated to a pretty provincial, isolated area, the Arabian Peninsula. You did have some Arabs in the Levant, in places like Syria, and what was then known as Sham by the Arabs, which is Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon. In that area, you did have Christian Arabs, and so they would have been exposed to some degree to the Byzantine tradition, the philosophical tradition of the Byzantine Christians. But the Muslims discover the Greeks, and I think that sets off a new trajectory, because prior to that they were definitely rooted in their tradition, but suddenly they discover the Greeks. They also discover Christian theology. So the Christian theology suddenly kind of excites them. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a verse in the Quran that says that Christ is the kalima, which could mean logos. I mean, it means word, but obviously it could mean logos. So this was a question that the Christians posited to the Muslims. If Christ is the kalima, the logos, is God's logos eternal? And therefore, is Christ eternal? So you can see the syllogism being set up there. And so that was a first kind of shock to them. And that develops what's called the Kalam tradition of having to deal with questions that are being posited to them. Because, I mean, I think any faith becomes challenged when it steps outside of itself and suddenly it's confronted with other positions, other views. And I think it makes faith stronger, especially when it's challenged by, even within itself, by heretical ideas. And this is where you get the dialectic between heresy and orthodoxy. And then very often there's synthesis. And so I think that's what's happening in that early period with these philosophers. They're thinking deeply about issues. They're also beginning to organize in a way, because the Quran is a book that comes with very, it's a non-linear book, and so it's speaking in first person, second person. It's something in Arabic called iltifat, which is very unusual. So God's changing constantly, we, you, I, he, and so that creates a kind of vertiginous experience when reading the Quran for people who are not accustomed to that. The Bible is much more linear. So when they meet the Greeks, they kind of are confronted with a much more structured way of viewing things. And so that begins to emerge, a kind of structured philosophy. And it becomes highly developed, and I think a lot of the most educated Europeans and Westerners generally know the incredible debt that Western civilization has on the Islamic tradition, including the Jewish tradition, which Imam al-Ghazali's famous Maqasid al-Falasifa, which is the aims of the philosophers, was translated into Hebrew and became, it was really kind of like a dummy, philosophy for dummies, but it became a major work. And in fact, Professor Chertoff, who was at Columbia University, did his PhD on the influence of Ghazali on the rabbinical tradition.
What are some of the fundamental ontological aspects of Islamic philosophy? Obviously, God is the preeminent element, but one question that comes up in various traditions is the world that God created real, or is it just sort of the emanation of God in some almost virtual sense?
Right, and I think the Muslims generally, our tradition adheres to a kind of correspondence theory. There is an idea that God has created a world that is matched with the mind, that it's not a trick, it's not a Descartesian, Cartesian demon who's fooling us in some way. We're not in the matrix. That my experience of you, that you are objectively real to me, and that my mind experiences you, and that I can assume that you indeed do exist. And we can exchange ideas because our minds are designed to be able to collaborate in that way. So I think the Muslims really do believe that there are many verses in the Quran that say that God created the heavens and the earth with truth, bil-haq. And so there's an idea that truth is here. And that the beautiful word in Arabic for world is alam, which means the instrument of knowledge. And so the idea is that the particulars of the world are meant to take us to an aggregate that leads to an understanding that God created the world. And so it's designed, and our minds are designed to move towards a knowledge of God. There's a beautiful book that was written called Hayy ibn Yaqdan. It's a famous book, The Awake, Son of the Awake, but it's a philosophical musing by an Andalusian philosopher that actually had influence in the West. And his idea is a kind of Robinson Crusoe character who comes, he's on a desert island, he has nobody, and he begins to just reflect. And his reflection ultimately takes him to God. And so the Quran definitely has this idea about if you reflect deeply. There are many verses in the Quran telling us, reflect deeply, think about these signs. And the fact that the Quran calls, there are two signs. The signs that are actually the verses of the Quran are called signs, so they need to be decoded. But then there's also the idea that the greater world is...
It's a natural theology approach.
It's a natural theology. And I think one of the beauties of the Quran is it's constantly telling... some people think religion is telling us to stop thinking and just simply become dogmatic and just be fideistic. And the Quran is saying, think. Haven't you looked at the camel, how it was created? Haven't you looked at the winds, how they work in such magnificent order? So there's this idea that there's order in creation, and that order has to have some design. I mean, one of the reasons that the Quran gives for understanding God is that there's a kind of providential care that God has given us. And there are many verses that tell us about the blessings. Like, haven't you seen how everything is, we made the earth. There's a beautiful verse that says, we made the earth a bed for you. And in the commentaries, they say it's neither too hard, like rock, so you couldn't build on it, nor is it too soft like sand, so you couldn't live on it, but he made it in that middle area, like a bed. You know, you don't want a bed too hard or too soft. And so those are the kind of blessings that, and then food, the diversity of food, all these things. The idea is to reflect on these and to kind of come to conclusions that there's a creator behind this. There is a source behind this. It's an intelligent source, and it's a source that speaks to us through these individuals, the great Jewish prophets. We believe that Christ obviously is one of the prophets, not son of God, but a prophet, and then the prophet Muhammad. So there is, and it's not limited to the Jewish prophets. There's a belief in the Quran that tells us that every peoples have been given prophets. So the Asian peoples had their prophets. The native peoples here in America had their prophets. Everybody has been given some kind of access to this supra-rational world, because our intellects, science has a ceiling. There's an unknowable aspect of what's beyond that, and so that's where metaphysics comes in.